At first, they don't seem connected. Different towns, different years, different little girls living completely different lives. A walk to school, a night festival, a quiet road, a front porch just steps away from safety. And then they're gone. No witnesses who saw enough, no evidence that led anywhere, no one held accountable. Just stories that ended too soon, and questions that never did. But then you start to notice something, a pattern. Not obvious at first, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. A man who didn't stay in one place, who moved from town to town, state to state, working carnivals, blending into crowds where no one was looking too closely. A man who had access, who had opportunity, who was always just passing through. And his name? William Henry Redmond. And this is Death Kiss Traveler, the only podcast that dives deep into horror, hauntings, and the dark side of amusement park history. My name is Marissa, your morbidly curious host. And like a scary roller coaster, this episode has a warning sign too. This episode is true crime and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised. For your safety, keep your hands inside the ride at all times, because what's waiting outside isn't a part of the attraction. Now let's get into our story. William Henry Redmond was born on January 22nd, 1922, in a world that looked very different from the one we know now. America was still shaking off the dust of World War I. The Great Depression was just around the corner, and the small-town life, especially in places like rural Pennsylvania, was tight-knit, watchful, and sometimes suffocating. Redmond entered the world in an era where discipline was strict, emotions were often buried, and what happened inside a home stayed inside a home. Very little is publicly documented about his childhood, and that silence, that's where things start to feel off. Because Redmond grew up in a household that included an older brother, Brian E. Redmond, and a sister named Rose Redmond. The records are a little thin. Neighbors didn't talk, and that's when history kind of leaves the gaps. And sometimes that means it wasn't meant to be seen. As a boy growing up in the 1920s and 30s, Redmond would have been surrounded by hard times. Struggling families, fathers working long hours, if they could find work at all. Mothers held households together with whatever they had, and children learned early how to survive. But survival can shape people in very different ways. For some, it builds resilience. For others, it builds something colder. As William entered his teenage years, the first real signs of who he was becoming began to surface. In 1935 in Lancaster, he was arrested for the first time after assaulting two young girls. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a pattern beginning. He was sentenced to time in both the Ohio State Reformatory and the Ohio State Psychiatric Hospital, two very different places. One meant to punish, the other meant to understand. But neither seemed to stop what was already taking shape. Just 3 years later, in 1938, at the age of 16, Redmond was arrested again, this time in Canute. The charges? Attempted assault on a preteen girl, resulting in a lengthy institutionalization within the state's youth correction system, until around the end of World War II in 1945. Then, years later in 1949, his name would surface in another case, this time in Florida, where he was charged with sexual assault, different state, same behavior. At one point, Redmond also would serve time under the Dyer Act, which is a federal law involving interstate transport of stolen vehicles. This was a bad dude. And when he was eventually released from the United States penitentiary system, he didn't disappear. He kept moving, because by now, this wasn't just a troubled teenager making bad decisions. This was a pattern, one that crossed towns, crossed state lines, and he was only getting started. When William Henry Redmond walked out of prison, he didn't go back to a quiet, stable life. He chose movement. He chose anonymity. And he chose the road. Somewhere along the way, Redmond found his place in the world of traveling carnivals. And that's where I come in. Because if you've been listening to this podcast, you already know carnivals aren't just bright lights and laughter. They're temporary. They're chaotic. And they're gone before anyone has time to ask too many questions. In the 1940s and 50s, carnival life was exactly that. There were no real background checks, no constant records, and workers drifted in and out, sometimes using different names, sometimes leaving behind nothing at all. It was the perfect environment for someone like Redmond, because in a carnival, you don't have to explain your past. You just show up and you work. He traveled from town to town in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and beyond, setting up rides, working the Midway, blending into the noise of generations, music, and crowds. Always surrounded by people, but never really known. And here's the part that makes this so chilling, is carnivals attract families. Kids are running between the games. Teenagers stay out late under the neon lights. Parents are distracted, assuming it's safe because it feels safe. For Redmond, this wasn't just a job, it was access, it was mobility and cover. Over time, whispers began to follow him. Nothing loud at first, just stories. Concerns, uneasiness that seemed to linger after the carnival packed up and left town. It was the kind of feeling that you can't quite explain, but you know something's wrong and you don't forget it. And remember, this wasn't a man with a clean past trying to start over. This was someone who has already had a pattern, a history that had followed him across state lines. So when similar concerns began surfacing again, it wasn't coincidence. Because the scariest part, he didn't need to hide in the shadows. He was standing right there in the lights, smiling, watching, and waiting. And as the carnival kept moving, so did the stories. And eventually those stories would turn into something much harder to ignore. What followed wasn't a clean slate. It was his pattern. Between 1950 and 1987, Redmond continued to pick up charges. Nothing that kept him locked away for too long. There was disorderly conduct, minor offenses, short sentences. Just enough to put his name on the record, but never enough to stop him. And every time things got too close, he moved from town to town, state to state, carnival to carnival, always just out of reach. There were warrants that were unserved, parole violations that had slipped through the system, paper trails that didn't quite connect. And when you look at it all together, it starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like someone who understood exactly how to disappear in plain sight. The stories I'm about to share are about the victims who disappeared in the middle of ordinary life. Short walks, familiar places, moments that should have ended safely. One of them was a girl heading to school, a child just playing outside, a quick stop just steps from home. Nothing reckless, nothing unusual. And life, well, it was just as it was supposed to be. And then something changed. Someone changed it. It wasn't loud or violent, at least not at first. Just a little conversation, a stranger who didn't seem threatening, a decision that felt small, but wasn't. Because in each of these stories, there is a point where everything still looks normal right before it isn't. And for decades, these cases stayed exactly that, separate. Unconnected, just tragic stories of children who never made it home. But then a name started to surface. Not in headlines, not with certainty, but quietly. William Henry Redmond. A man who lived his life in motion, working carnivals, and sometimes even driving trucks, moving from town to town. Never staying long enough to become familiar. The kind of person who could show up in a place for a few days, blend into the noise, the lights and the crowds, and then disappear just as easy. The guy wasn't someone people noticed. And maybe that's what makes him so dangerous. Is over time, investigators began to see those patterns, the places he'd been, the timelines that overlapped, cases that felt similar. There were children taken near roads, near festivals, near neighborhoods where everything felt safe. He was a shadow, a man who seemed to always be nearby when something went terribly wrong. It was supposed to be an ordinary summer day, the kind of day where kids run in and out of the house, where parents don't worry when the screen doors slam behind them, where a bike left in the yard means they'll be right back. But in 1951, in a quiet neighborhood, something shifted. And that neighborhood would never feel safe again. 8-year-old Jane Marie Althoff was, by all accounts, exactly what you'd expect. Bright, playful, and full of that kind of childhood energy that makes a house feel alive. The kind of little girl who didn't just exist in a place, she filled it. That day she stepped outside, and like so many stories we've told before, that was the last normal moment. At first, no one panicked. Kids wander, they get distracted, they follow a friend, they chase a dog, or lose track of time. Normal kid behavior. But minutes turned into hours, and hours turned into something heavier, something wrong. The kind of wrong you feel before you can't explain it. Her family began searching, neighbors joined in. The neighborhood, once quiet and predictable, became a blur of voices and calling her name. Jane, Jane, come home. But there was no answer. And then came the moment every parent fears. The shift from missing to something far worse. Her body was eventually found. What happened to her was brutal, far beyond what anyone could imagine for a child. The details shook the community to its core. This was not an accident. This wasn't something that could be explained away. This was violence, deliberate, personal, unthinkable violence. And suddenly the world didn't feel the same anymore. Parents who once let their children play freely began watching more closely. Doors were locked. Trust, once given so easily, started to crack. Because whoever did this wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows of some faraway place. They were close, maybe closer than anyone wanted to believe. Investigators worked the case, trying to piece together Jane's final movements. Who saw her last? Where'd she go? Who had been nearby? But like so many cases from that time, answers didn't come easily. I actually can't imagine trying to solve a murder in 1950. No DNA, no forensic evidence. Those cops were relying heavily on intuition and real physical evidence, which wasn't much back then. And that's what makes this story kind of linger. Not just the tragedy of what happened, but the silence that followed. Because somewhere between the search, the discovery, and the investigation, a piece of that town disappeared too. The kind of innocence that never comes back. Jane's murder wandered free for decades. For nearly 40 years it sat. Cold, quiet, and untouched. A case buried under time, memories fading, evidence disappearing. And finally, someone decided to open it again. And when they did, all the pieces pointed to one man, William Henry Redmond. A carnival worker, a drifter, a man who had spent decades moving from town to town. But this time they were looking, because what they believed happened was brutal. Investigators alleged that Redmond had taken his victim into the cab of his truck, right near a carnival site in Trainer, Pennsylvania. What followed wasn't just violence, it was suffocation, assault, and a child who never made it out alive. And for decades, absolutely nothing, no arrest, no justice, just a name that lingered quietly in the background. Until 1986, and that's when the case reopened. And suddenly, Redmond wasn't just a name anymore. He was charged with murder, manslaughter, kidnapping, and assault. It looked like after all of those years, the truth was finally catching up to him. But this is where the story shifts, because instead of moving forward, everything started to unravel. The prosecution's case hinged on one critical piece of evidence, a confession, allegedly given by Redmond while he was being transported across state lines. But there was a problem. There was no physical evidence, no eyewitness, no one who could truly place him there. Just that confession and the word of one man, a state trooper. And buried inside his report was something else, a confidential informant, someone whose identity was hidden, protected, and never revealed. Redmond's defense zeroed in on that immediately, because if this case was built on one man's testimony, that testimony was influenced by an unnamed source. Then who was really telling the truth? They pushed hard, and they demanded the name, arguing that without it, there was no way to properly challenge the case against him. And then the court agreed. The judge ruled that the identity of that informant wasn't just helpful, it was essential. Because if it could potentially clear Redmond or weaken the prosecution's case, then it had to be disclosed. But the state refused. They wouldn't give the name. And I honestly don't know why. It kind of blows my mind that they weren't willing to give up that name, but it must have been very important because that decision, well, it changed everything. Because without compliance, the court made the move that essentially gutted the case. The state trooper, the key witness, was barred from testifying, which meant the confession was absolutely gone. The backbone of the case gone, and just like that, a case that had taken nearly 4 decades to bring back to life had collapsed. Appeals followed, delays stretched on, time kept moving, and Redmond, he walked, released on just $1 bail. It's so frustrating. But it's because he was a 66-year-old sick man with emphysema, and the court, well, they didn't see him as a threat. And before anything could ever go to trial, before any jury could hear the story, before anyone could answer what really happened, on January 2nd, 1992, Redmond died at the age of 69. He died from emphysema while hospitalized in Grand Island, Nebraska. And with him, every remaining charge. They were all dropped, gone, no conviction, no acquittal, no resolution. Just a case opened and then only to close again forever. And maybe the most unsettling part isn't just what happened, it's that we almost had answers. Almost. But in the end, the story didn't end in a courtroom. It ended in silence. But our story isn't over. Because at one point while he was in jail, he made a comment almost casually that this case was the only one they knew about. And that changes everything. Because it suggests there are more, and possibly a lot more. Our first possible victim went for a walk, the kind of walk a child could do without thinking. The kind of walk parents in 1949 didn't worry about. No phones, no tracking, just trust and routine. On the morning of September 19th, 1949, 11-year-old Joanne Anna Lynn stepped out of her home in Hemlock, New York at exactly 8 a.m. She was dressed for school, a blue and white candy-striped dress, a red sweater, white bobby socks, and tan shoes. It was the kind of outfit someone would remember, and people did, because that would be the last time anyone would see her alive. She never made it to school. And at first, when she had disappeared, it didn't really feel urgent. I mean, a delay, a distraction, a friend's house. But as the hours passed, something started to feel wrong again. By the afternoon, Joanne's mother knew, and when she called authorities, a quiet farming town suddenly shifted into something else entirely. Search parties formed, and neighbors looked through fields, along roads, calling her name into the open air. But somewhere between her front door and that short stretch of route on 15A, Joanne had vanished. And then came the sightings. Witnesses reported seeing a girl matching her exact description standing near a gray sedan. Pennsylvania license plates, a car that didn't belong, a car that shouldn't have been there. And in that moment, the story changes because now it isn't a child who wandered off. This is a child who was taken. 5 days passed. 5 days of searching, hoping, waiting until September 24th. A 14-year-old girl named Norma Marsden was out gathering butternuts on a farm. Kind of sounds picturesque. It's about 4 miles from Hemlock. It was quiet, rural, the kind of place you wouldn't expect to find, anything, just some berries. Until she did, she found Joanne lying face down in a ditch, hidden in a grove of locust trees about 200 yards off the road, 7 miles from her home. Just 7 miles where she should have been safe. And what they found was devastating. The autopsy revealed that Joanne had been shot twice. A 9mm semi-automatic pistol, likely a German-made Luger. The kind of weapon you don't just stumble across. This is the kind that someone carries with intention. One bullet had entered her forehead, but not before passing through her arm, which means in her final moments, Joanne raised her arm to protect herself. She saw it coming. The second bullet entered her chest and exited through her back. And if that wasn't enough, there was evidence of a struggle. Fingernail scrapings showing she fought back hard against an adult male. There were also signs of an attempted assault, one that for reasons unknown was never completed, which, these cases, they're so frustrating. Her red sweater was gone, her undergarments were missing, and the rest of her clothing was just left behind, like the person responsible started something and then stopped, or maybe he was interrupted or decided to do something else. Investigators believe she may have been held for days. Some reports suggested gunshots were heard in the area as late as September 21st, meaning Joanne may have still been alive for 2 days after she disappeared. 2 days of torture. And that is what makes the story so dark, because just 6 miles south of where her body was found, there was something else happening at the exact same time. The Hemlock Fair, a carnival. Bright lights, music and crowds, strangers coming and going, trucks pulling in, rides being assembled, the perfect cover. And within that world, one name would surface again. William Henry Redmond, a carnival worker at that fair. It didn't take long before he became a suspect, but like so many cases back then, there wasn't enough, not yet. And so years passed, then decades. And Joanne's case, like so many others, started to fade until 1989. Investigators searching Redmond's home while looking into other crimes made a discovery. Undergarments belonging to young girls. They were kept hidden. And that is so gross. But suddenly, Joanne's case didn't feel like an isolated tragedy anymore. It felt like something much larger, something darker. And then came something that didn't exist back in 1949. Forensic testing on Joanne's clothing produced a profile, a biological trace left behind by the person who killed her, a voice from the past. And by 1991, investigators formally named Redmond as the prime suspect. But here's where the story turns one more time. There's never been an arrest, no conviction, no one ever stood in the courtroom and answered for what happened to Joanne and Elaine. But her story matters. She mattered. She had a family who loved her. And I wish I could say these stories are over, but they're not. It was supposed to be a fun night. Music playing, kids laughing, families gathering in the park, and the sun slowly dipped below the horizon. On August 24th, 1951, Halloran Park in Cleveland, Ohio was alive. It was the annual Show Wagon Festival, drawing in crowds from all over. It was the event. And somewhere in that crowd was 10-year-old Beverly Rose Potts. She had come with her friend Patricia Swing. The two girls had done everything right, left their bikes at home, stayed together, moved through the festival like kids do. excited, distracted, completely at ease. Because why wouldn't they be? They were surrounded by people, the lights, and safety. At least that's how it looked. At around 8:40 p.m., Patricia left, and she would later say that Beverly stayed behind, standing near a woman, a small, plump woman, with her hand resting on Beverly's shoulder. Not aggressive, not alarming, almost familiar. The kind of interaction that doesn't make you stop and stare, the kind you walk past without thinking twice. Some believe the woman may have had just a child performing in the show wagon, just another parent, another face in the crowd. But in that moment, something did happen in plain sight. Time passed, music played on, and at some point after the festival ended, around 9:30 p.m., Beverly was seen again, alone. Walking home, she was just 150 feet from the corner of Lynette and West 117th Street, 4 blocks from her house, 4 blocks from safety, 4 blocks from making it home, and then she was gone. No scream, no struggle, no one running, just gone. By 10:30 p.m., her parents knew something was wrong. She was a responsible girl. She knew the area and she'd walked those streets before. But that night, when she didn't come home, police were called and searches began investigating immediately. Neighbors, officers, volunteers combing the streets, the parks, the surrounding areas, calling her name into the dark. There was nothing, no footprints, no clothing. No sign she'd ever made it past those last few blocks. As if she simply disappeared too. This incident was chilling because it happened at a festival. A place filled with those temporary workers, traveling crews, strangers moving in and out of the city without leaving a trace. And decades later, one name would quietly surface in connection to the case just like this. William Henry Redmond, that carnival worker. In 1988, investigators questioned Redmond about Beverly's disappearance. Not because they had proof, but because the pattern was there. Children, festivals, vanishing without a trace. But when asked, Redmond said nothing. No denial, no explanation, no cooperation, just silence. Ooh, I hate him. Because in that silence, that is where this story still lives. Because Beverly Rose Potts was never found. No remains, no confirmed suspect, no answers, just a little girl last seen in the crowd, almost home, and then gone. And our next story started with something small. The kind of thing that happens at summer camp every single day. Horseplay, laughter, kids just being kids. But that morning, it ended with blood. Not serious, just a bloody nose, but enough to shake her, enough to make her homesick, and 10-year-old Connie Smith was far from home. She was from Saratoga, Wyoming, spending her summer at Camp Sloan, a YMCA camp tucked in the woods of Salisbury, Connecticut. She still had a week left, but something about that morning kind of changed. It was July 16th, 1952. Around 7:50 a.m., the camp was waking up. Kids heading to breakfast, counselors moving between cabins, the usual rhythm of a summer morning settling in. But Connie didn't go with them. She told the others she needed to return an ice pack to the dispensary. It was simple, harmless, the kind of excuse no one questions. Except she never returned it. Instead, she left it behind in her tent. And quietly, without telling anyone, she walked away. She didn't pack, no extra clothes, no food, no money, just a small black zippered purse, possibly with a few photos of friends inside. She was wearing a red windbreaker, blue shorts and plaid cuffs, tan shoes, and a red ribbon tied in her light brown hair, a bright, unmistakable little figure. Walking away from camp into the unknown. She was sad. She had a bloody nose and she was wanting to get out of there for a little bit. Around 8:15 a.m., the camp gatekeeper saw her. She was near the entrance picking daisies. Just a little girl standing there in the morning light like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't about to disappear. Then she kept going, down Indian Mountain Road, away from the cabins, away from the counselors, away from anyone who knew her name. She walked nearly a mile and a half alone. In warm, heavy summer air, at some point moving along the way, a housewife saw her. Connie had been crying. She asked for directions to Lakeville. Why Lakeville, no one knows. She was trying to go home, trying to get somewhere safe or just somewhere else. And then there's the moment that changes everything. Around 8:45 a.m., she was seen standing along U.S. Route 44, thumb out, hitchhiking. Just 10 years old, alone on a roadside, and this breaks my heart. A passing couple would later say they saw her in their rearview mirror, getting smaller and smaller as they drove away. And that image is the last confirmed sighting of Connie Smith. Back at camp, no one realized she was missing, not at first, because everything about her leaving was quiet, intentional, easy to overlook. And it wasn't until later, when counselors found the unused ice pack still sitting in her tent, that something clicked. Something wasn't right, and by then, she was already gone. What followed was massive, and remember, this is the 50s. State police, search parties, bloodhounds, aircraft scanning from above, riders on horseback, combing through woods and fields. They searched everywhere, the roads, the forests, the surrounding towns, calling her name, looking for absolutely anything, a footprint, a piece of clothing, or just any sign that she'd been there. But there was nothing, no trace, no evidence, no answers. Just a road where a little girl once stood, waiting for a ride. And I have a 10-year-old, and I cannot imagine him hitchhiking. Oh, that breaks my heart. Years later, as investigators began looking into a pattern of child disappearances, one name surfaced again: William Henry Redmond. In Connie's case, there was no proof that he had ever been there. No witnesses placing him in Connecticut at the time. No connection strong enough to hold. He was questioned. Connie was never found. No remains, no confirmed suspect, no explanation. Just a 10-year-old girl who woke up homesick, walked away from camp, and stood on the side of the road and disappeared into thin air. And maybe that's the most haunting part of this story, is that Connie wasn't taken from chaos. She walked into it, step by step, mile by mile, until she reached a place where one decision, one car, one person changed everything. And this next story was a walk she'd probably done a dozen times before. 6 blocks, that's it. 6 blocks from home to church on a quiet March morning in Detroit. March 24th, 1955. 7-year-old Barbara Garza left the house on Faircrest Street, heading toward Assumption Grotto Catholic School for morning mass. It was early, calm, and familiar, the kind of routine that feels safe, the kind of routine no one questions. She made it part of the way. A young boy would later say that he saw her near Lyndhurst Street and Greah Avenue, which is 4 blocks from the school. She was waiting for a friend, just standing there like any child would, not afraid, not rushed, not aware that this would be the last moment anyone would see her alive. Because somewhere between that corner and those last 2 blocks, Barbara disappeared. When she didn't arrive at school, something wasn't right. And when she didn't come home, that quiet morning turned into something else entirely. Searches began, neighbors looked, police got involved. But just like that, she was gone. Only 1 week later, on March 31st, a railroad worker made a discovery. Not in the neighborhood, not near the school, but 25 miles away, in a landfill in Oakland County. Wrapped in a blood-stained army blanket was Barbara. What had been done to her was brutal. Really, it's unimaginable. She had been assaulted, strangled, and stabbed 15 times. Her small body was left in a place meant for things that are thrown away, as if she didn't matter, as if she could just be erased. But even in that horror, there were details that told a story of her final hours. Investigators determined that she had likely been killed within 2 to 4 hours of being taken, which means this didn't happen far away. This happened quickly, deliberately, in a controlled space, a clean vehicle or a room, somewhere the person responsible felt comfortable, confident, like they had done something like this before, or believed they could get away with it. And then there was something else, something small but really unsettling. Barbara had eaten chocolate-coated peppermint candy shortly before her death, candy that was given to her while she was in distress. Think about that. In her final hours, she was scared, emotional, and someone offered her candy. Her belongings were scattered nearby. A white rosary, a pencil case, a composition book, pieces of her life left behind like fragments of a story no one could fully piece together. And then came the witnesses, because unlike some of our other cases, this one had glimpses, just little moments of people who had seen something. But not enough. At a nearby gas station, there was reports of a green 1954 Hudson sedan. Inside was a frightened little girl matching Barbara's description. And behind the wheel, a man around 40 to 45 years old. 5'6", 150-ish pounds. Ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of man that you wouldn't look at twice. At the landfill, another sighting, a different car. A light-colored Buick, trunk opened, and a tall, thin man nearby. 2 vehicles, 2 sightings, 2 possible pieces of a puzzle that never fit together. Because for decades, investigators chased leads. Thousands of volunteers searched, tips came in, suspects were considered, and at one point, even this name surfaced again, William Henry Redmond. Because by then, a pattern had started to form. Children, abductions, violence. But this time, the timeline didn't match. Records placed Redmond in New Mexico in March of 1955, working pretty far from Detroit. And just like that, another possible answer kind of disappeared. In 1996, the case was entered into the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. Profilers looked into it, compared it, tried to connect it to something, anything. But even with all of that, no one has ever been arrested. No one has ever been charged. And there's no answers for what happened to Barbara Gassa. And just because William wasn't in Detroit at that time, his name is still on the suspect list. Because really they don't know for sure. On December 3rd, 1957, in Sycamore, Illinois, 7-year-old Maria Rudolph was outside playing with her friend, 8-year-old Kathy Sigmund, near the corner of Center Cross Street. It was early evening. The streetlights were beginning to glow. Snowflakes were drifting down around them as they laughed. Nothing felt wrong until he showed up. He came from the south, a young man, early 20s, clean-shaven, tall, around 6 feet, wearing a multicolored sweater, the kind of detail that would stick in your mind. He walked right up to the girls and he started talking. He was casual, friendly, asking about their dolls. Normal questions. Too normal for any parent. Then he gave a name. Johnny. Not who he really was, just a name he wanted them to hear. At some point, he offered Maria a piggyback ride, and she said yes. Because why wouldn't she? He didn't seem dangerous. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grab her. He just fit into the moment. Maria even ran home quickly to grab her doll. Think about that. She went home. She had a chance to stay there, to be safe, to never go back out. But she returned back to the corner, back to him, and then everything changed in a matter of minutes. Kathy left just briefly to go get her mittens. A simple thing that saved her life. The kind of thing that happens 100 times without consequences. But when she came back, Maria was gone. The man was gone, and that corner was empty. Her doll wasn't left behind, just fresh snow, quietly covering whatever had just happened. Some neighbors would later report hearing a scream around 7 p.m. But by then, it was already too late. And again, the search began immediately. Police, volunteers, the FBI, roadblocks were set up, cars were stopped, people were questioned. The entire town mobilized. Because this wasn't just a disappearance, this was something else, and this happened fast. But there was a problem from the very beginning. The scene had been compromised. Too many people, too many footsteps, too much movement, and snow. And one person who saw him, Kathy, was just a child, trying to remember a face she'd only seen for several minutes. In months passed, winter turned to spring, and on April 26, 1958, a farmer and his wife made a discovery. 90 miles away, in a wooded area near Galena. Partially hidden beneath a fallen tree, it was Maria. She was still wearing her slip, her socks, and nothing else. And what makes this case even more haunting is what they didn't find. No signs of stabbing, no gunshot wounds, no clear evidence of strangulation, no confirmed sexual assault, just silence, a cause of death that couldn't be fully explained. Some believe suffocation, others considered exposure, but there's no definitive answer. Nothing that told the full story of what she went through. And just like that, the case shifted from missing child to murder. Years had passed, leads dried up, and the case went cold for decades. Then in 1997, something changed. A police lieutenant reopened the file and came to a conclusion. He named a suspect, William Henry Redmond, that carnival worker, a man who had been linked, at least circumstantially, to other cases involving children. The theory was built on pieces: a jailhouse statement where Redmond allegedly admitted involvement in one other child abduction. He resembled the description: tall, clean-shaven, known to wear distinctive sweaters. Even the name Johnny, Redmond's nickname, Billy, not the same, but in their minds it was close enough to raise questions. William worked as a truck driver for a little bit of time, and his trucking routes followed the paths that stretched through Illinois, near where Maria disappeared. Near where her body was found, it was a pattern, a possibility, a theory, but that's all it was. Because there's no proof. There was no record placing him there that night, no forensic evidence tying him to Maria, nothing that could hold up in court. And when the case was revisited years later, even that theory was kind of pushed aside and another man was charged, then cleared, and once again the truth slipped away. And a lot of our stories are from the late 50s, but this one is from August 13th, 1987 in Norfolk, Nebraska. 9-year-old Jillian Dean Cutshall, Jill, was walking to her babysitter's house on a simple route, a short walk. It was around 6:30 a.m. when she got there, or at least when she got close, because the last time anyone saw Jill, she was sitting on the porch, tying her shoelaces. Just a little girl paused in a normal moment, fixing something small before stepping inside. But she never went in, she never knocked, she never even made it through the door. And somehow no one realized right away, what kind of babysitter is this? Because hours passed. The morning turned into the afternoon, and it wasn't until after 3 p.m. that anyone reported her missing. Think about that, nearly 9 hours where no one knew where she was. And no one knew that something terrible already had happened. By the time the search began, whatever had happened to Jill was already far away. Police searched, volunteers joined in, the community rallied, which I love in all of these cases. The community comes together, but there was no sign of her. No struggle on the porch, no obvious clues, just absence. Then 3 months later, in November, hunters were out in the Wood Duck Wildlife Refuge. It was about 10 miles from where Jill had last been seen. It is remote, quiet, and isolated, and that's where they found something. Not Jill, but pieces of her. Her clothing, her shoes, her keys, scattered, just left behind. And what those items suggested was terrifying. Investigators believe there had been an assault. The condition of her clothing had pointed to it, but without her body, there was no answers, no cause of death, no way to fully understand what had happened in those final moments. Just silence where the truth should have been. But of course, a name enters the story. That one name that keeps showing up is William Henry Redmond. By the late 1980s, Redmond had settled in Nebraska after years of drifting, working carnivals and moving place to place. But this time he stayed in Nebraska. He was close enough to Norfolk, close enough to where Jill had disappeared. In 1988, when investigators searched his home, they found something so disturbing: undergarments. Undergarments and underwear that had belonged to young girls. Hidden, kept. It was that pattern. It was his signature, something that linked him, or at least his behavior, to cases like Jill's. Authorities began to look closer because Jill's disappearance wasn't random. It happened during a routine, a predictable moment. A child alone at the same time in the same place. Exactly the kind of opportunity someone like Redmond would recognize. There were even whispers that during questioning, he had alluded to more, other crimes, other children, but he said nothing, and they couldn't prove it. There was another man's name that was tied to Jill's case, David Phelps, and he was convicted in 1991 of abducting her with the intent to commit sexual assault. He was sentenced to life in prison, but even then, there was something missing because no one was ever charged with her murder. No one was ever held accountable for her murder. And Jill, well, she was never found. Not fully, not completely. Just pieces left behind in a quiet place, miles away from where she should have been safe. At first, these feel like separate stories. Different towns, different years, different girls, but when you step back and really look at them, you can see that pattern. And it's not random, it's really calculated. Look at the moments they were taken. Joanne was walking to school. Beverly was at a festival surrounded by people. Constance, well, she was leaving camp alone on a road. Barbara was walking to church, and Maria Elizabeth, well, she was playing outside in the snow. And Jill D. Cutshell was on the porch right before going inside. These weren't random locations, they were routines. Predictable moments, short distances, familiar paths, places where they should have been safe. And that's exactly why they were targeted. Now look at the timing. Early morning, early evening. Moments of transition, not in the middle of the night. Not when things feel dangerous, but when people are relaxed, when parents think they'll be fine, it's just a quick walk. That's when the predator moves. And here's the part that's most unsettling in every case. There was a moment of normal interaction. A man talking, a woman standing nearby, a child asking for directions, someone offering a ride, someone offering candy. Nothing aggressive, nothing that would trigger immediate fear. Because predators like this, they don't start with force, they start with trust. If you take all of these cases and strip away the locations, the years, even the names, what you're left with is behavior. And that behavior tells a story. Because whoever did these things, whether it was one man or more than one, they weren't acting randomly. They were following that pattern. And patterns come from psychology. First, control. In almost every case, there's no chaotic struggle in a public space. No loud scene, no witnesses describing panic. That tells us something important. The person didn't rely on force, at least not in the beginning. They relied on compliance. They knew how to approach a child, how to speak to them, how to lower their guard. That's not impulsive, that is practiced. The second is targeting. Look at all of his victims. They were all young girls, alone or briefly alone in moments of transition. Walking to school, leaving a festival, stepping away for just a moment. That's not coincidence. That's selection. And this kind of offender doesn't just take whoever is available. They watch and they wait. They choose a moment where the child is far enough from safety, but not far enough to expect danger. And our next is a place where the offender feels comfortable moving through them. So these aren't hidden, remote locations, they're everyday spaces. Campgrounds, neighborhoods, roads, carnivals, which all of them just blend in. They're not drawing attention. Someone who can stand in a crowd or drive through a neighborhood and look completely normal. And that's kind of where this becomes really chilling, because psychologically, these types of offenders live a double life. To the outside world, they seem average, quiet, even helpful. But internally, there's something very different happening. This is someone adapting, someone learning, possibly becoming more confident over time. And that's something we see in serial offenders. They refine their behavior, they take what worked and adjust what didn't work. And last, there was souvenirs. Items belonging to the young girls were kept, hidden, preserved, That's not about necessity, that is psychological. Because offenders like this, the crime doesn't end when it's over. They relive it. They revisit it. Objects become a way to hold control long after the moment has passed. When you combine all of these, a picture starts to form. This is someone who is patient, observant, socially capable enough to gain trust, comfortable moving between places, and driven by a need for control, not just in the act, but before and after. Which is why a name like William Henry Redmond kept coming up. Because of his lifestyle, his constant movement, temporary work, access to crowds and children, fit the pattern, not perfectly, but enough to raise questions that never fully went away. And maybe the most unsettling part of all of is nothing about this kind of person looks obvious. They don't stand out. They don't announce themselves. They just exist. Watching, waiting, blending in until the moment comes and everything changes. Now I have to ask myself, if someone existed like this today, what would they look like? Because that's the thing, we want to believe predators like this belong in the past, in the black and white photos, old case files, different timelines. But the psychology, that doesn't disappear. It actually just evolves. Today, someone like this wouldn't need to rely on chance encounters alone. They'd have access, constant access. Think social media, local check-ins, photos, routines shared publicly without a second thought. They wouldn't have to watch from a distance. They could study you from a screen. That is so scary. And instead of standing on a road, they might be scrolling, looking for patterns. What time does this child walk to school? Who posts when they're at home alone? What is the family routine? It's the same behavior, just modernized. And the approach, well, it wouldn't always be in person. It would probably start online. A message, a conversation, a slow build of trust. Because just like before, this type of person doesn't start with force. They start with connection. But here's what hasn't changed. Opportunity. Because even now, kids still walk short distances, still go to parks, still wait outside homes, still step just a little too far from supervision. And those moments, they still exist. The environment's changed, but not completely. Think about it. We still have festivals, fairs, sporting events, busy neighborhoods, places where people are distracted, where strangers just blend in. There's no one watching everyone. And someone like this, they would still blend in. They wouldn't look dangerous. They wouldn't stand out. They might even be helpful and friendly, just normal. The kind of person you'd pass without thinking twice. But the biggest difference today is technology that can track, record, and capture moments that used to disappear. But even with all of that, cases still happen. Children still vanish because no amount of technology can fully stop someone who is patient enough, calculated enough, and willing to wait for that exact moment. And that's the part that lingers. Because when you look back at these cases, they weren't about darkness. They weren't about isolation. They weren't about timing. Moments where everything looked normal until it wasn't. So if someone like this were here today, you wouldn't see a monster. You'd see someone ordinary. Someone, let's be honest, forgettable. Someone who knows exactly how to disappear in plain sight. We tell ourselves that these are old stories. Different times, different world, different kind of danger. But when you really sit with it, not much has changed. Because every single one of these girls, Joanne, Beverly, Constance, Barbara, Maria, Jillian, they weren't doing anything dangerous. They weren't in the wrong place. They weren't taking risks. They were doing normal little girl things. They were living their lives exactly the way they were supposed to. And still, someone found them, waiting for that one moment where everything looked like normal. And I hate cases like this because you don't get closure. You don't get that moment where you can say, okay, we know what happened. Instead, we're left sitting with it, thinking about how close they were, how normal it all felt, and how fast everything changed. And it just sticks with you because deep down, you know this didn't happen just once. And maybe that's the part that stays with you, is it's not violence, it's not even the mystery, it's how close they were from safety. Because evil doesn't always look like what we'd expect. It doesn't hide in the dark. Sometimes it just stands in the snow and says its name is Johnny. Sometimes it waits at the edge of a festival, and sometimes it's a car on the side of the road at exactly the wrong time. And whether it was one person or many, names like William Henry Redmond linger in the background, never fully proven, never fully erased, just there, like a shadow that never quite goes away. Because the truth is, some stories don't end, they just stop. No answers, no justice, no closure, just questions that echo long after everything else has gone quiet. So tonight, when everything feels still and everything feels safe, just remember, for them, it did too. So stay safe, my friends, and I will see you next week for a story like I have never done before about a family curse. And when you are a trapeze artist, the last thing you want is a family curse. This episode is written and recorded by me, Marissa. Produced by Sunkissed Traveler, the travel agency that takes the stress out of planning a vacation. Wherever you want to go, Sunkissed Traveler can help. See show notes for details or visit sun-kissedtraveler.com. I'll see you next week.